Hey everybody, and welcome back for another video. Today's video, as you can see from the thumbnail, we are talking about the worst movies of 2024. Like, these movies suck. We're going to talk about from our number five and then moving up to number one. So number one is the worst. Number five, not as bad, but definitely bad. And we're just going to work our way up. We'll start with my top fives, and then we'll kind of put Sarah's in there along the way as well. So let's
I'd say my
just,
top three are pretty strong. My four and five, they're not as strong.
well, small spoiler alert. If you've been with us since the beginning of the year, you know what my worst movie of the year is. There's a movie that was the absolute worst, and then it stayed the worst the entire year. So there's a spoiler alert for if you've been around with us. But my number five movie kind of pains me a little bit because there's a lot of people in this movie that I love to follow their movies. But unfortunately, this movie, even though a lot of my favorites were put into one movie, it did not work. And that movie is Borderlands. Borderlands has Jack Black, it has Kevin Hart, Jamie Lee Curtis, bunch of big names. And I mean, Borderlands is a very, very successful video game. And to top it all off, I was really excited when the director was Eli Roth because I love Eli Roth films. But here's the problem. I love Eli Roth's horror films. This was not a horror film, so maybe this just wasn't quite his genre. Maybe the writing was terrible. I have no idea. But what I do know is that this movie did not work out for me, and it did not work out for the masses. The company lost its butt on this movie. What did you think of Borderlands?
I thought it was okay. It's not gonna make my top five worst movies. It wasn't that great, but there's another one that pained me more, and so it just didn't make the list. I feel like Borderlands would probably be an honorable mention or a dishonorable
I was
mention
about to
in
say,
that
what an
email.
honorable thing to have.
My number five was actually Smile 2. It Like I said, my top three are really strong. My four and five, not so much. I don't know that I go to say that this is the worst film. Clearly, it's not number one, it's number five on my list. But it just didn't hit for me. It wasn't super engaging. It wasn't super necessary, I think. The first movie of Smile was a lot stronger than this one. I
A
don't feel
lot.
like this one had any of like the super cringy elements that the first one had that kind of made it work. Um, it it's an okay film for me. It's not that great. It's pretty bad, but it's not the worst. So that's at my number five.
Yeah, I would agree with you that it was relatively a bad movie. It did not live up to the first one by any means because I watched the first one like the day before we went to go see this movie, and I was up late. You had already gone to bed. It was like, I don't know, 1 in the morning. So spooky time to lower the lights and watch the movie. And it was tense. It was a very, very eerie movie. This one, not so much. I think we were probably wondering more times, how can she guzzle that much water in 30 seconds than the scary moments in the movie? So,
I
um,
feel like they took it from a horror movie as the first one to this one's more of a psychological thriller, but it just wasn't that thrilling for me.
right. I'm right on board with that. So, um, it did not make my top five worst movies, but just like you said about Borderlands, it could be a dishonorable mention. Let's see. My number four slipped in at the last second because I had forgotten about this movie. That's how bad it kind of is, but I had forgotten how bad it was. And my number four, it's kind of like Borderlands in a way, where there's people in this movie that I thought was going to make this movie fantastic. But really, it was an utter, utter failure. And that is, I can't say the real name, so I'm going to say the abbreviated name. Joker 2. Joker 2,
Joker Folie à Deux.
there you go. Um, I did not do well, thank you. But yeah, this movie did not hit for me. I thought it was going to be interesting. Like they brought Lady Gaga in as Harley Quinn, which I 100% supported. I feel like she could do an amazing Harley Quinn. Then they talked about it being partially a musical. Made a lot of sense because Lady Gaga is a singer, and if you're not aware, Joaquin Phoenix can sing too. He played in Walk the Line. He sang his parts.
And he did a
So,
great job in that film. That's an excellent film.
right, and it won awards and everything. And so it doesn't make any sense how bad this movie ended up being. I would argue it could definitely be on a most disappointing list as well. I have not thought of what my list is yet, but that definitely could fit in there. But I do not see myself watching this movie ever again. I don't really see the only time that I think we probably would is if there's some sort of surprise Joker 3 that's announced and we just decide to watch the first two again. But the way that this movie ended, it's just like, why would I care anymore? Don't want to give away spoilers. But yeah, this movie was terrible. What did you think?
I feel like it probably should have been on my list, but
It's probably one you forgot about too.
yeah, there's others that I thought were more deserving, I think. I maybe it'd be a number six for me, I suppose, but my number four is actually The Strangers Chapter One. I barely remember this film, and I think it's because I've tried to block it from my memory. Like it wasn't a very great film. I don't remember a whole lot about it, just being totally honest and blunt on it. That's why it's ranking in at number four and not like number one.
Well,
But
maybe with this idea that you don't remember much of it, maybe we'll ring a bell when it comes up and a little higher on my list.
oh, it's higher on your list, huh?
That one is higher on my list.
All
Yep.
right. Well, then we'll dive into it when you get up there.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that one. But it's not my number three, so it's even higher than that. My number three is Night Swim. I thought this movie was very boring. The horror really wasn't there. There's a lot of times that we were wondering, how does this make sense? When is something interesting gonna happen? And I just really didn't vibe with this movie. I feel like maybe you or your mom vibed with it a bit more than I did because I feel like I remember you liking it more, but I just
I
thought this movie was so boring.
I rated it much higher than you did.
I would much rather jump into a pool after watching this movie than watch this movie again.
And Jeremy's not a fan of swimming, so that says something.
Correction. I'm not a fan of swimming where I don't know what's around me. Correction. So like if I jump out in the ocean or in a lake, a little iffy. But in a swimming pool, as long as I don't see a little floaty thing going by, I'm okay.
Well, there was a lot of floaty things going on in that night swimming pool. They saw a lot of things going near the drain that was pretty nasty. But yeah, I rated that movie quite a bit higher than you did. Looking back, sometimes you have thoughts that maybe this was our first movie of the year for 2024, so we didn't have a ton to compare it to. Do I think it holds up to the eight that I gave it? Probably not, but it definitely doesn't make my top five worst movies.
And hey, ooh,
I know, it was our first movie of the year. Give me a break, okay?
makes me
Uh,
nauseous thinking of a seven.
My number three, and like I said, my top three I think are pretty strong. I really didn't like this movie, and it's A Quiet Place Day One. I loved A Quiet Place. I thought the sequel was pretty good, not as good as the first one, but A Quiet Place Day One was awful. It just the intensity wasn't there. The actors, although they had good acting people, they just I don't know if it was the lines or what, but they just weren't that interesting. They weren't that fun to watch. There wasn't a whole lot going on. I feel like they could have cranked the scariness of this film so much more, and they just I don't know, it just fell really flat for me.
So that one's not on my list. I would love to talk about some of my thoughts on here. So I liked the original Quiet Place movie. The second one was kind of iffy for me. This one, I had some pretty high hopes for. for a couple of reasons. One, thinking about what happens on day one of this sounded amazing, like seeing the alien invasion and how people are reacting to it. And also, number two, the lead actor, the dude from Stranger Things, this was like his first big role that I saw after seeing him in Stranger Things. And so I was like really hyped to see what can he do outside of Stranger Things. And honestly, this one, there was just not, aside from seeing the first initial invasion, which is what I was excited to see, none of the rest of the film was interesting. None of it. And so that would be a dishonorable mention, in my opinion. Here's another thing, too. Okay. So this movie came out in 2024, right? Universal does Halloween Horror Nights. You would think they would want to do, like, if they announced they were doing a Quiet Place themed area for that event. You would think with this movie coming out this year, they would put that out there, right? Huge promotion. No, they made that themed after the first movie. The one that's the most successful. So that kind of tells you how this movie really is in comparison to, how the company thinks about how good it is. You know, it doesn't make sense to me if you're gonna like, for instance, they had Ghostbusters for the Halloween Horror Nights, and they did do the Frozen Empire for that. They didn't resort to like the originals or anything like that, which I would have preferred the originals, but I went with the flow with the Frozen Empire. But you can't tell me that the writing is on the wall here, right? They went with it for Ghostbusters, and they totally did the Heisman on A Quiet Place day one and put in the one that was way more successful. So I think that tells a lot about the film. So
Yeah.
okay. My number two is the one that was mentioned already. Strangers Chapter One. I really like the original Strangers. I liked the second Strangers movie. I know a lot of people, like when that movie came out, a lot of people around me because when that came out was when I first started working at Family Video. I mentioned that in our other video that I worked at Family Video at one point, and I remember my boss just ripping about this movie, the original second one. But I liked it. I thought it was pretty interesting. And then the company decided to reboot the series and they went with Strangers Chapter 1, which then Chapter 2 will come out, and I think eventually Chapter 3. Chapter 1 was an awful, awful debut for this series. It doesn't make any sense to me where you have the first one, the original, that did really the original. I will tell you this. This is another telling thing for how good the first one is. My dad is not really into horror movies, okay? I remember when my dad rented the original Strangers when it came out. That movie was based on a true story of people being taunted by these strangers that had came to their door. And like I said, my dad watched it. He never watches horror movies. And in my opinion, I think he liked it. This movie, I think he would turn this movie off in the first 10 minutes. It was just so, so bad. It doesn't really emulate what happened in the original, so I really don't think that this movie is trying to, pay homage to the true story behind it. And the acting was not very good. There's a lot of questionable things in it. It did not work for me. I don't know if that helped jive your memory at all about this movie. Um, but
Maybe just a little, but honestly, the only thing I remember is you pointing out the difference to me of the first movie, like the original, having the tension of the couple not meshing, and this one
yeah,
they're like super in love. So
yeah,
that tension was missing.
yeah. The original, the couple basically came back from going to somebody's wedding, and we know that things are not going well for their marriage. There is tension between the two, and then we add in the tension of what's going on around them, right? And then in this other movie, we just start the movie as if it's a romantic comedy, and then it kind of turns into, the horror movie, and it just didn't quite work. And I'm pretty sure, didn't this movie come out in like the summer? Because we saw it at the drive-in. And I'm pretty
I think
sure
so.
the original plan was to have this one come out in the summer and have chapter two come out around Halloween. Newsflash, chapter two has not come out yet. So that kind of tells you what's going on with that movie. What is your number two?
My number two is Madam Web. This movie was awful.
I
Are you
thought
surprised?
I thought I remembered you saying like a week ago that it wasn't as bad as you thought. Maybe that was my sister. I don't know. Someone said that.
Your sister really liked this movie. I did not. This movie was terrible. I had a really hard time picking between putting this on my most disappointing versus worst films. So I'm trying not to have overlap. There were a lot more disappointing films, so I wound up putting this one not on the disappointing list, but just on the bad list. It was a bad movie.
I would
It
much rather
was
watch that movie than any movie on my list.
It was such a slow burn, and it's not even, I don't think there was even a burn. It just was slow. There was no big finale that was exciting. I'm trying not to give spoilers because if you want to see this movie, by all means, go see this movie. Like we
Oh,
said, his
I was about to
his
just
sister
rip right into the spoiler.
his sister liked it, so maybe you will too. But for me, it really wasn't it. And I think that the best thing that I can say that is kind of a spoiler, but not really a spoiler.
The trailer, I was gonna say the trailer is insanely deceiving.
Yes. The movie does not focus on the superpowers nearly as much as what the trailer wants you to think. You think it's going to be a superhero movie and it's really not because I'll just leave it at that. It's not a superhero movie, but that's what it was advertised as. And so you take a superhero movie and you take out the superhero powers, and it's just boring. It's like Impractical Jokers when they tried to pitch Superman just the Clark Kent stuff. Nobody wants just the Clark Kent stuff. That's boring.
And they tried to bring people into the movie theater with some of these actors and actresses, right? Because we had the woman from 50 Shades. We had Sydney Sweeney. We had the the jerk brother from Step Brothers. I don't remember all their actors and actresses' names.
Dakota Johnson was the 50 Shades girl.
Yep. The other guy, he's also from Parks and Rec. But there is a handful of people where it's like, oh yeah, this could be a good movie. All these people are in it, and then it just
You're
didn't
think
work.
you're thinking of Adam Scott. Emma Roberts was also in it.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. And
Yeah.
honestly, she's probably my favorite of the bunch.
She was not in it very much.
Yeah, I don't remember a whole lot about that movie, but
But
it would definitely be
anyway,
an honorable mention. Dishonorable mention.
yeah. That was my number two.
Okay, so neither of us have made mention of our number one worst movie of the year. I am very curious to see if we have the same one. My number one movie of the year, like I said, was the number one worst movie of the year since the beginning of the year. It was our second movie we saw the entire year, and that's really how we started it. And my number one movie, that is
So
the
you're well, hold on. The first movie we saw and the second movie we saw are both on your top five worst movies. That's pretty sad.
yes. My beginning of 2024 was very sad. I almost needed a tissue. Um, my number one worst movie of the year is Founder's Day. Founder's Day did not belong in the movie theaters. I would think, I don't want to disrespect any other channels, but this felt like a Hallmark horror movie. Like it was the acting was horrible. I'm not saying Hallmark movies have horrible acting. It didn't mesh with what it was supposed to be. This movie, it had horrible acting. The point of the movie was a ripoff of Thanksgiving. They were trying to basically, you know, piggyback off of that. They because the villains they looked very, very similar, even though they were different, quote unquote. But Thanksgiving was miles ahead of this movie. The plot at the end was kind of it made sense, but it didn't at the same time. I remember not feeling the greatest about it. Let's see. What else did we have in this movie? I don't think really anybody was a big name. I don't recognize any of these faces. So there
Well, a lot
wasn't.
of times people who like those Hallmark movies, they like it for the cheesy romance or the are they going to fall in love? Are they not going to fall in love? They're not there for the acting. You don't go there because you're a good actor. You go there because, you can pull off the love story and you can be charming, and usually it's because you're really cute or really hot.
There is
That doesn't really work in horror films unless you're about to die. So,
there was one actor in this movie that I thought was worthwhile, and that was William Russ. And if someone told me that name, I would not recognize it. But if you're like me and you grew up in the 90s, this was the dad from Boy Meets World. And so this whole time I was honestly, I remember watching the movie and I was like, dang, that guy looks like Jerry Springer. But I thought Jerry Springer just passed away. But no, it was this guy. It was William Russ. So um, if I were to give this movie any positivity, I would say Russ's character was cool. Most of that was because I recognized him. But ultimately, this movie was just so bad, cheesy in the wrong ways. Acting was awful, and it did not work. There's a reason they threw this in January and not October.
this is going to be a dishonorable mention one for me. It's not on my list,
How did
but
this movie not make your list? This was like the one movie I thought about giving a one to.
my number one is also one that I don't think should have been in theaters. It's somebody who has been trying to make a name for themselves by making horror movies off of public domain characters that everybody loves.
Oh,
And so my number one is Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, number two. Uh, we saw the first one. It was all right. It was kind of cheesy. I'm not saying it was a great film, but I feel like this one was so much worse. And we recently went and saw the new Peter Pan Neverland movie, which is in this same universe, not necessarily the same characters or anything, but made by the same people because they're, like I said, they're trying to make a name for themselves by making horror movies off of public domain. And I get that, there's a niche for that. But this just, I feel like this particular one they really wanted, one of the creators really wanted to be in the movie. And I'm not saying he's a bad actor, but I feel like he maybe focused so much on the idea of I can be in a movie that's in theaters that they didn't plan enough about the plot of the story. And it just, I don't know. It for me, it was a bad film. I don't think it should have been in theaters. I feel like it should have been one of those straight to release, to rent at home or buy at home type films. It seems like one of those kind of knockoff. This is going to be really mean, but it's my number one worst movie. I feel like this is one of those knockoff films you'd find in the $5 bin at Walmart. It just doesn't seem like one that should have been in theaters.
I mean, there's a couple things with that. I do not disagree that it's a bad film, first and foremost. The one thing I will say though about the $5 bin is that, that is the quality of the movie. It it was only in theaters for 3 days, and those days were weekdays, not the weekend. So I think they kind of understand that, but at the same time, they know that there's an audience out there that likes these ridiculous films. But I will agree, this movie was terrible. I feel like, wasn't it? I don't remember what I thought of the original because we didn't rate movies back then, but I remember this movie was, I think,
Yeah, the original we did not rate, but I recall at least liking the original, although there was a couple editing issues where maybe the editing wasn't 100% there. I feel like the first one was at least a good film or at least an average film, and this one just fell way shy of that one. It in some ways it feels like kind of a cheap shot because it's not made by one of the major movie companies. And like you said, it was only in theaters for a handful of days, but at the same time, it was a major disappointment, and I really would not watch this again. I would entertain the idea of watching the first one again, but not this one.
Here's the other thing with that too is unfortunately what I think this company is going to run into with an issue is that they had a big success with the first movie. They got a lot of money from it. And they probably see this as here's a lot of money. We can invest all of that money into um, into these other films, and then we'll make that kind of money or relatively similar with those films, and it'll, basically explode like this. And I think they're gonna run into potentially fatigue from the viewers because seeing like when you see four different Marvel movies, they are very different from one another. These movies kind of feel roughly the same because of the way that they are. Um, I do think that Peter Pan was the best of the three so far, but I think I mentioned it even in my movie review. I think Bambi is going to hit hard, like low. I don't think that movie is going to do well at all. Like what do you do with Bambi in a horror film? Seriously? And then they still have two other movies coming out on top of Bambi this year. So I think they're gonna run into where people are gonna eventually taper off. They're not gonna care as much, and I think they're just jumping into it way too fast. So,
Or
but
even Sony, who's trying to come up with however many Marvel movies or not Marvel, excuse me. Um, what do you call that? Spider-Man universe movies?
the Sony verse is what they
Sony.
call it.
Okay, yes, thank you. They came out with, I think, three Sonyverse superhero movies last year, being Madam Web, there was the new Venom movie, and then there was a third one too, I think, Kraven the Hunter. So Sony is way bigger than these guys, and they came out with three movies last year, and all of those movies flopped compared to, say, Marvel movies. Just, you know, because they're taking on too much. So now you look at this company that's doing the horror movies. Three movies in a year is a lot, and their team has got to be way smaller than Sony's. So I don't see it working out for them. I really don't. I feel bad for them because the first movie I thought was a lot better than this one, but this one just it wasn't there for me.
I will say, I do hope this is an instance where I'm proven wrong. I want to see success for these people because it is a cool idea, taking these childhood stories and making them horror stories. There's something intriguing about that. But again, at the same time, they're going very, very fast. And sometimes when that happens, your fame, stardom, rich, money, all that good stuff, sometimes that can go to your head. And what you eventually lose is the quality and you're pumping out quantity. And so hopefully they still have that balance in the back of their mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's see. Just to recap, my top five worst. My number one was Founders Day. We just talked about that one. My number two was Strangers Chapter 1. Number three was Night Swim. Number four was Joker 2. And number five was Borderlands. Sarah, can you remind us what yours were?
My top five, starting with number one as the worst, was Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. Number two, A Quiet Place, Day One. The Strangers, Chapter One. Oh, hold on here. Reverse that order. Get rid of that order. Sorry, I'm reading them in the order that I wrote them, which is not the order of my top five. So sorry. My number one was Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, number two. My number two was Madam Web. My number three was A Quiet Place, Day One. My number four was The Strangers, Chapter One, and my number five was Smile Two.
Very nice. All right, so those are our top five that each of us for worst movies of the year of 2024. If you like this movie, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Drop us a like if you liked it, and then also drop us a comment letting us know your thoughts on your top five worst movies of the year, and also your thoughts on our top five worst movies of the year. And then, as always, everybody, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.